going to take a look at the basics of programming. So let's take a look at this. So first thing is, why understand programming? Well, one, it's going to give you a perspective of how the process or the processes are involved in actually structuring the code. Understanding the basics of the creation of the program, and then the ability to provide any kind of suggestions to various team leads. So what is a programming language? Well, in a nutshell, it's going to be a set of rules over instructions for that particular language. Now, these rules and instructions are designed to basically perform some kind of operation or function for the device, or perform some kind of algorithm. Now, there are grammatical rules associated with every programming language, and that's typically referred to as syntax. So if we look at syntax in greater detail, so syntax is going to be the rules to coding for that particular language. And again, it's going to be unique to that language. Now, breaking the rules, errors will definitely occur. Now, here are some examples of each language or different languages and how to initialize a variable. So for example, in Python, we have x is equal to 7. So we're assigning a variable of x and giving it a value of 7. Simple and straightforward. In C++, slightly different. We're prefixing it with the word int. We're identifying that the value or the variable x is an integer. And then you notice that at the end we have a semicolon. And here we have JavaScript, and the thing that we need to do is prefix it with the word var to the system knows that it's a variable that we are identifying. So if we look at what a program is, again, it's going to be a sequence of instructions, or basically blocks of instructions for a computer or device to perform. Now, before you start coding, more involved code typically involves some kind of design. And typically that is done with the use of flowcharts, which is a graphical visualization of the program. So something like this. So it helps you better understand what needs to be done and how the code needs to be written. Another way is utilizing what we call pseudocode. So basically, in plain language, we describe the steps that are basically need to occur one after another. So it's not quite as writing code, but it gives you an idea, again, the steps and the processes that is involved to actually write the correct syntax for it. Now, some of the coding basics, we have variables, routines and subroutines, conditional statements, the user interface, and something that is very important is the use of comments. Comments are ignored in the code, but it helps the developer and others to look at the code as well as to maintain the code. So it's very important to put comments in the code. So each programming language may have or will have a unique way of identifying comments in the code. So the programming process works like this. So we have our input, we have our program, and then we have our output. Now, with all that, we have our specific programming language. As you know, we have specific syntax with some specific keywords. Now, inside the program, again, we have variables, loops, conditions, and functions. So all this basically helps out with what we call flow control. So if we take a look at variables in more detail, so it contains a value, and that value could be a string, a number, or any kind of data type. And if we take a look at this, once again, these are different ways to initialize the variables in different programming languages. Loops, another very important element in programming. So basically, it's a block of code, and here's the thing, the keyword here is repeats. It repeats until a specific condition is met. So two most common types of loops are basically for loops and while loops. So we have a for loop. You notice that we have a test expression, and that expression basically executes while the condition is true. Once it's false, then it basically routes out and does other things in the program. Now, a for loop is going to be different than a while loop. So in a while loop, generally speaking, you can notice that we have num1 is equal to 0. So somewhere before we get into the loop, we have some kind of initiation or initialized statement or something along that line. So while the condition is true, continue the loop until the condition is false. So you notice that here, while the condition is true, we're going to do some kind of activity, and then we're going to increase the value. So for example, num1 plus equals 1, that increments by 1 value and keeps on going. And then while the condition is true, it keeps on moving through that. Then once the condition is met, basically it's false, it exits out of the loop. Conditional statements are different than loops. So if we take a look at conditional statement, so it is just a simple true or false type of expression. So it only executes once. So we have our test expression. If it's true, the block of code executes and then off it goes. If it's false, it goes a different path, and we may have also different blocks of code that we may need to execute after that. So one of the things we'll get into is the different structures of the if statement. Functions, all right, these are critical and important when it comes down to programming. So a function is going to be a block of code used to perform a specific routine or task. So this is an example in Python of how to structure a particular function. So as we get a little bit more advanced in the coding, one of the elements and topics we'll be working with is a function. Now, the relational operators. So this is something that helps us with the conditional statements and the loops. So we have the greater than, less than, greater or equal to, less than equal to, and not equal to. So these are the different operators for testing to see if a condition does one thing or another. Now we also have logical operators. Now this is slightly different here. So we have double equal to see if the similarities are the same, and that if they are, the condition is true. And we're testing out two conditions. If they're the same, then it executes, or meaning one statement needs to be true in order for something to execute, or not, or basically negation, where we end up doing the opposite of what it's supposed to be. So we'll be doing some programming and utilizing these particular components as well. So there you go. So those are some of the basics that we'll be learning in the programming language.